So I was all set to give a more of a focused talk tonight on the Bible as literature and the literary art in the Bible, and then lo and behold, Ron did a really good job with that last week, and so I decided to kind of transition and change up a little bit, but. We will be talking a bit tonight about literary, a bit of literary aspect to the Bible, as well as sort of my more main focus, which I'll get into here. So anyway, as mentioned, I think I know many of you out there. Some of you are new faces to me, but thanks for coming out tonight. Okay, so I have a story to tell you. How many of you are married? Okay. If you're not married, this is not meant to sideline you in any way. So before I got married, my wife Jen, we've been married now 14 years. I got the ring and I was going to get engaged, and the day came where she was visiting from Seattle and we were going to go out to the beach where I was going to propose to her. And I had this grand plan to send my brother out ahead of me to the beach, to this particular spot along the coast of the South Jetty, just south of Florence. And he was going to set up this picnic blanket and have these flowers waiting at the picnic blanket. And there was going to be a bottle of wine with a couple of wine glasses, and there was going to be this cooler of like fruit and strawberries, and I think there might have been a little chocolate. And the plan was to get to the beach and walk down the beach to the designated area and happen upon this place, right? And when we happened upon this place, all was going to fall into order because my wife, Jen, was going to see this, and she was going to realize, and I was going to drop on one knee. So and it was all this beautiful plan. And then we're going to watch the sunset together at the beach and then head back in. So we get to the beach, and I am like completely overwhelmed, and just all the emotion inside me, and I've got the ring in my pocket, and how many times I had to figure out whether I was going to leave the ring in the box or take the ring out of the box because the box was kind of bulgy and you didn't want to give away. So anyway, so finally I decided I'm leaving the ring, I'm taking the ring out of the box. But so we get to the place, the parking lot where we're going to park, and my brother has the signal. The plan was for him to set up the picnic blanket a ways down the beach from where we were going to enter the beach, up and over the dune, so that we could walk along the beach for a ways and we'd have a chance to talk. And then the sign was going to be that he set up this wood tripod down by the waves, because I did not want the picnic blanket to be right there, with the water lapping on it, and who knows who coming upon, this special space. So the idea was to kind of have it up away from the water. And so he was going to leave me this driftwood tripod in order to signal to me where to sort of focus my attention and be like, okay, that's where we're going. So we're walking and we're having a nice time. But of course, I'm completely, I'm of two minds. One of my minds is where is that tripod? Where is that tripod? And the other mind is trying to just enjoy the company of, this woman that I want to spend the rest of my life with. And I'm pretty sure she's going to say yes, but this is a surprise, will be a surprise for her. So we get down and we see the tripod, and I look up. Oh, and the other thing I forgot to mention is I had him build a fire. Because, you got to have a fire, right? When you're watching the sunset. So I have him build a fire. So we get there and we look up and I see the fire, and, it's up, it's kind of on a little raise up on the dune. and we see the smoke, and and now the question is, and I didn't think this through very well, is how am I going to get her, Jen, to move with me up there without it being like super just obvious, and so I'm like trying to play it cool, and I say like, what is that up there? And my wife is actually, I'm married up. Everyone that you know, everyone who knows me knows that I'm married up. And of course, my wife is like, it's fire. And I'm like, yeah, but like, that's strange. I don't see anyone around. Let's go check it out. And she's like, no, it's someone else's fire. Why would we go up there? And I'm like, oh, well, and so, as fast as one's mind can, one begins to figure out how we have to overcome this minor obstacle. And I'm like, well, I just don't feel comfortable knowing that there's this open flame and there's no one else around. And she's like, it's a beach, Ryan. Like, what's going to burn? And so right. I'm still married to this woman, and so at that point, I just say, you know what, Jen, can you just please come up there with me? And she's like, fine. So we start moving up there, and as we get closer, we're still, some yards off, but as we get closer, like all of a sudden, details start coming into focus and things come into view. And all of a sudden, she sees a blanket, right? And the sun shining, and she sees like sun glinting off of the wine glasses. And all of a sudden, she's like, fire, wine glasses, blanket. And she stops, and she says, Ryan, I see, and she names these things, someone is up there trying to have a romantic moment, and I am not going to go up there and ruin that moment. And I was like, you're darn right someone's trying to have a romantic moment inside. And I'm like, Jen, please. She's like, no, there's probably people having sex in the bushes up there. I'm not going up there. And at that point I realize, and she says, I'm going back. So she like turns around. And at that point I had to, like grab her by the arm gently, get down on my knees right there, and I propose to her, and I'm shaky, and she puts two and two together and realizes like, oh, this is for me. And she cries, and she says, absolutely. And so we go up, and it was amazing, right? It's amazing. And after we're done, watching the sunset, and it's definitely getting darker. This is April on the beach. We pack up and we start walking back up the beach towards where we had parked the car. We get up over that dune, and as I look down, what do I see but our car with its headlights on dimly, right? And I'm like, no. So I sprint down the dune, and I get to the car. I fumble for my keys. I get in. I try to turn the car on as fast as I can to hopefully salvage whatever spark is there. And no, there's nothing, right? We're the last car in the parking lot, except for some really creepy van across the way. And, there's no lights at this parking lot. There's like a porta potty. And so my first instinct is to call my brother. How far he's like, hey man, we're already almost back to Eugene. And so all of a sudden it's dark. We're stranded there. We just had this most amazing moment, and we're stuck. And so to make it even worse, Jen's like, I need to go to the bathroom. So she heads to the bathroom, and then all of a sudden, this creepy van across the parking lot turns on. Like, we had been standing there for quite a bit of time. And like, if this person was like watching us at all, they would have seen like, yeah, we're kind of stuck. And all of a sudden, this creepy van turns on. Jen's in the bathroom, and I'm on the phone with my brother. And all of a sudden, I panic. And I get this intense fear. Like, that person over there wants to do ill towards me, and possibly Jen, and my closest, the person who knows I'm out here, is already like 60 miles away. And here I am, what do I do? And all of a sudden that van starts pulling. It doesn't pull out of the parking lot. It starts pulling closer, and it doesn't turn its lights on. And all of a sudden, I'm like, Jen, stay in the bathroom, keep it locked. I yell at her. And as the van gets closer, I see two people come into view that are in the front of this van. And I'm freaking out. And all of a sudden, the van pulls up, and I realize, like, oh, like, one of these people is a woman, one is a man. They rolled down the window, and he was like, hey, we saw that your light was on. We've been waiting to give you a jump. And I was just like, I just melted, right? I just melted. Just to go from like the highs and then the lows. It was quite a night. Now, stories are powerful. I just told you a story about an event that happened to me. And I want to ask you guys a few questions as sort of a segue into what I want to say tonight. But we've all heard it said that story is one of the most sort of formative and powerful things that we have as humans and in culture, and that stories are universal. And one of my questions for you, and I want to kind of tease this out a little bit, is why are stories so powerful? What happens, and this is not a rhetorical question now, what happens when we listen to stories? What happens?
It seems to me that one thing that stories do is they cultivate both empathy and sympathy. So I'm starting to imagine myself in your place as the proposer and the disappointment and the questions and trying to figure out what's going to happen next. Mm-hmm. And so I start to align with where you might have been had I been in a similar situation.
Okay.
So that's happening to me.
Yes. So as the listener, we start becoming connected to the characters in the story. Okay. What else happens when we listen to story?
We're also connected with our own past, in that to put ourselves in the shoes of whoever is telling the story, we have to have experienced something like it before. So we're now being connected with our own experiences, our own memories, our own past. So there's not only a kind of horizontal connection happening, but kind of internal one as well.
Yeah, I like that. Other thoughts? What happens when we listen to story?
We get to know the other person. This experience. We get to know the other person. We have this experience of interacting with them. I mean, like, what Chris was saying and Elliot were saying, we put ourselves in the shoes, but we also connect with them as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Know them.
Right. I like that. Any other ideas? What happens when we listen to story? Let me ask this question. Who do listeners tend to identify with in story? Who do we tend to identify with?
Not people in the van.
Okay. So
heroes.
We identify with heroes, with the good guys. There's another reason we don't identify often with the people in the van. Why is that? Who's the primary player in a story? What do we call this person? protagonist, the main character. Okay, we tend generally to identify most with the main character of the story. That's not true necessarily always, but for a good deal of time, I think it's a truism that we tend to identify with that main character. Well, stories are really appealing for a lot of reasons, and this is not my area of expertise. So I'm going to share a few things that I've picked up some information around. But one of the things that is true about stories versus if we're listening to, for example, someone just tell us information, data, facts, is that when someone is sharing information with us, let's say it's a PowerPoint presentation or where the information is coming to us in a format that is non-narrative, it only actually, according to studies, lights up the language processing part of our brain. Whereas when we are listening to narrative, when we are listening to story, apparently what happens is that we experience the same things in our brain as the character is actually experiencing in the events of the story. So we have the visual part of our brain light up. We have the emotional part of our brain light up. We have, for example, if the story is in some way, shape, or form connected to fear, we have that the parts of our brain that the fight or flight piece comes in. And so we're actually, because of the way our brains are wired, story triggers in our brain the experiences and the feelings and the emotions of the actual person or character that had the experience that we're listening about. And that's pretty incredible. Now, apparently also, one of the other things that is true is that story, when information is embedded in a story, we as human beings tend to be, and I don't know how they quantified this, but psychology today says that we as humans are 20 times more likely to remember information that is embedded in the form of story than when, for example, that information is coming to us in other forms. Okay, and I think that that feels true to my own experience, because and here's the real like rub of this. The sad matter of this is that most of you are going to walk away tonight, and one thing you're going to remember is my story of getting engaged, right? Or at least that will be one of the primary things that you remember, because I shared story with you, right? And I'm going to share some other things with you, but the reality is that story and narrative causes us and our brains to light up in ways and to connect in ways that we wouldn't otherwise. And so story is powerful. Story is really powerful in that way. Tertullian, one of the church fathers in the 2nd, 3rd century, famously said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" And Tertullian was, for those of you who know much about him, he was really, and a lot of his work was based on, as an apologist for Christianity, as Christianity is moving into the Greek world. And so this quote, this statement of his, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" really gets at the core of something that I want to talk about tonight, because we have a Christianity, and this class is on the intersection of literature and Christianity. Christianity is a religion that is based in story. Now, when you think, and I don't, when you understand and know where Athens is coming from, so Jerusalem represents the God of story. And Athens represents the philosophical sort of understanding of the divine that is so perfect, that is so untouchable, that the divine can't in any way, shape, or form interact with creation. And so in Platonism, of course, we have this, we have the pure forms, we have the pure divine. And what you don't have with Athens is you don't have story. We don't have a God who has intersected with the world in such a way so as to create narrative about his interaction with the world. Now, of course, the Greeks had their mythology and all of that, but in terms of the sort of the philosophical underpinnings of Athens, Athens is storyless, right? Whereas Jerusalem is based on a profound story that the God who both raised up and made it so, the city of Jerusalem, was the God who created narrative itself, and gave to us the Bible, the scriptures, and 60% of which are in narrative form. So that's pretty interesting. So we have a storytelling God. Christianity has a storytelling God, and I want to just quickly define story. When I say story, oftentimes we think in sort of dichotomies like, oh, story means like fiction and history is nonfiction, right? But I want to sort of just clear the deck and sort of just state up front that when I use the word story, what I'm talking about is the general genre of narrative. Whether we're talking fiction or nonfiction, I'm going to use story as narrative. And of course, when I start referring to portions of the Bible as story, what I don't mean is we're talking fiction. I just mean we're talking narrative. Okay? Any questions about that? Thoughts about that? Okay. So
Maybe I have a question.
okay, Toby.
So you stepped us into narrative almost as if to distance yourself from any sort of like verifiable truth claim or lack of truth within sort of like a differentiation between history and myth. You're just going to talk about the way stories unfold. Are you purposely distancing us from the real, the truth that actually occurred? Or what was your importance of making that differentiation?
Oh, no, if I've understood your question right, I'm not trying to distance us from there being an actual historical referent that these stories are pointing toward. I'm just trying to, I think story can be a buzzword, and quite a buzzword today, and I just wanted to sort of just say that when I talk about like story and Bible as story, I don't mean to undermine any historical or truth claims by so using that term. That's all I mean.
Okay. So, I think I understand. Thank you.
Okay. So, so story is powerful. Christianity is a religion that is primarily and fundamentally based on a story that continues to unfold. And the power of the scriptures of Christianity is that it provides human beings a story that they can both identify with and appropriate as being, in some very meaningful sense, their own story. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. Now, why is story so important? Why does it matter? Well, if we're going to talk meaningfully about why story matters to Christianity, I want to talk about how story is connected to worldview. Okay? So when I say the word worldview, worldview can be defined and has been defined in a lot of ways. But what I mean when I say worldview is that I mean that all of us, on some level, have a deep-seated sense of how things really are. So a deep-seated sense of reality, okay? A deep-level perception of the world, of my place in the world, and an understanding of how I make sense of reality. And lots of people have done a lot of thinking about worldview. One in particular, a historian, N.T. Wright, this is something that is informed by some reading I've done with him. But he argues that worldview gives us four. Okay? He says, first of all, worldview provides us with story or stories. Okay? And intrinsic to worldview, he says, are also a set of questions that are deeply embedded in every culture universally. Okay? And the relationship between the story that informs our worldview and the questions is that the story that underlies our understanding of reality both will bring up the questions and help to answer those questions. So, for example, there are four fundamental questions that our worldview and the story or the stories that we have or that are undergirding our worldview seek to answer. And the first one has to do with identity, and that is, who are we, or who am I? Okay? So that is the question of identity. Okay? Who am I? Right? The second is that according to Wright, every culture in the world, aside from having an identity, has an understanding and wants to understand their place in the world. And so, so the question that we seek to ask, that each culture seeks to ask, is, where are we? What is our environment? What is our place in the world? Okay? The third question that every worldview seeks to have an answer for is, what's our problem? What's my problem? What are we up against? What's the conflict? Okay? And then lastly, and that's the question of evil, and then lastly is that worldview seeks to answer the question, what's the solution to the problem? Okay? So intrinsic to this notion of worldview is story. Story undergirds our sense of how we understand the world. Narrative undergirds our sense of what it is that I'm living in and out of. And oftentimes, of course, these things are happening at an unconscious level. That we're not actively thinking about our story that we're living out of, but in fact, all of us have story that that is in fact informing how we understand the world, and ultimately informing who we see ourselves to be, informing our place in the world, informing what we see our problems are, and then ultimately informing what we see as the solution to our problems. Yeah.
Kind of like, what's my relationship to my environment?
Yeah, I think the sense is...
Or what's my relationship to creation?
Well, it can be. I mean, we can frame the question in different ways.
Just trying to understand.
I think the fundamental idea is, what is my place in this world? Like, what space is mine, and how do I understand my space and my place in the world?
Okay. How do I fit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Another way to put it. Okay, so a third aspect of worldview, he says, are, and again, and this is brought through the story and the questions and the answer to those questions, are the key symbols that inhabit the place in our lives of identifying for ourselves, you know, the important answers to these questions. Okay, so the symbols that the story provides are the expression of the worldview that we have. And then finally, every worldview has a praxis. That is, every worldview has a way of being in the world. We have a way of being. So essentially, if this is true, then there is an understanding for this. I think this helps us understand why story becomes so powerful for us. Because if, in fact, all of us at an unconscious level are living in and out of a worldview that is primarily based on a story a narrative that we see ourselves as being a part of and living out of, a narrative that answers some of the key questions of our lives. And through the answers to those questions, that story provides us symbols, that is, markers for ourselves, that help us to remain tethered to our understanding of reality. And that, in fact, our story, the questions, the answers, the symbolic world that we have also has and informs the way that we live in the world. And in fact, even though we might say that we have a particular sort of like ethic, it is generally true that our ethic is going to come and our practice in the world is going to belie the actual story and worldview that we're actually living out of, regardless of what we might say or think consciously that we're living out of. So story is profoundly important to our sense of worldview. And of course, worldview is, we can't get away from this. We all are naturally inclined as human beings to make sense of our reality. Okay? And oftentimes, we are provided with similar stories, not all the time, but these vary. But as certain subcultures and subgroups have obviously stories that they hold dear amongst themselves. So why do I outline this? Well, I outline this because the takeaway is that if this is true, then what we see in Scripture is interesting, because one of the primary stories of Scripture is the story of the Exodus. Okay, the story of the Exodus. And the story of the Exodus within the Hebrew Bible becomes is the quintessential story that helps to inform Israel and Israel's understanding of who they are, who their God is, and in fact provides Israel with all four of these pieces of worldview. Now, how do we know this? Well, one of the things that's true is that when you look through and you read through, when you read through Torah, when you read through the Exodus story, one of the things that gets called for over and over and over again is the call to remember what God did for his people Israel when he redeemed them out of Egypt and brought them through the wilderness and took them to the promised land. And in fact, after 39 years of wandering in the wilderness and Moses finally getting the people to the edge of the promised land, the book of Deuteronomy is basically a book that calls people over and 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 over again to remember each and every step of the way of what happened to them on this journey that God took them on. And in fact, it's not just a call to remember, but it's a call for the people to, in fact, align their entire lives and their entire understanding of their lives by this single story. A couple examples will suffice, I think. So, for example, Israel is given a basis for a national identity through this story. God, when he calls Israel out of Egypt, he identifies Egypt as, when he calls Israel out of Egypt, he identifies Israel as his son. And he says, I have called my son, and I call you my children out of Egypt, and I'm going to make you my people, and I will be your God. And they make a covenant in the wilderness, and the basis of that covenant is the understanding that God wants to love these people. He wants to be merciful to these people. He wants to keep covenant and promises from their forefathers, and that he creates in that moment at Sinai, he creates them as a people. And so this is the foundation of their identity, right? Also, aside from the Exodus providing the answer to the question, who are we? We are the people of God. We are Israel. The Exodus also seeks to provide and provides the people a praxis, right? We've got 613 laws that in the form of this narrative, within the scope of this narrative, come through in various ways, shapes, or forms. And many, many, many of the laws that God speaks to the people that they should live according to what he calls them and what he commands them. Many of these laws are undergirded with a singular raison d'etre, and that is because I redeemed you out of Egypt and I am your God, right? This is how you're going to treat your slaves because I redeemed you out of Egypt. This is how you're going to live in the land because I redeemed you out of Egypt. This is how you're going to do the Sabbath because I redeemed you out of Egypt. So a lot of their way of being as a people, the unique and peculiar way of being as a people, and the laws and the restrictions and all that God commanded was often undergirded with the reminder that you shall be this way, you shall do this thing because remember the story. Remember the story of what happened. So God, through the Exodus, provides them identity, provides them praxis. He also, of course, one of the important things he does to help ensure the memory of this story is that he prescribes that as a nation, they are going to keep 3 feasts each year. Okay? The first of the feasts was the feast of Passover and unleavened bread. And of course, that's the feast that signifies what? What was that feast supposed to cause the people to remember? Does anyone remember? Passover
is when the angel passed over and the houses of the children of Israel, and they had a marker on their door. Was it lamb's blood?
It was.
Yeah.
Yep. So.
And then we're supposed to. Oh, come on, really? You can hear me.
No, you're.
But anyway, yeah. So it was lamb's blood, and the other children were killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
well,
hard,
all the firstborn.
hard one to take.
All the firstborn of any household that didn't put the blood above the doorposts were taken. So that event, that moment of the Passover, the angel of death passing over, was to signify the first and the beginning of time for Israel. When God, that night, when the angel of death passed over, he says to Moses, Moses, this is going to be the first of months for you. And you're going to celebrate this Passover of unleavened bread to signify the redemption that I made of you, my people, out of Egypt on this very night. So that feast, the first of the three feasts that they were called to celebrate, was in fact the genesis of the Exodus. Was celebrating and bringing to memory the moment of redemption out of Egypt.
Was that the first thing that happened in Egypt before all the plagues and everything else? Was that the first way that he saved them, or, like you said, identified them?
If I understand your question correctly, the Passover, the angel of death, is actually the ultimate, the final thing that he does.
After the plagues and
it's after all the other plagues, exactly.
So it was the final thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, right. And then they were like, "Get out of here."
Yes.
Okay. Got it.
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. So they're prescribed to keep the Passover feast, and to do this, they were prescribed as a nation to come to the place that God was going to have his name dwell and celebrate the feast there. And of course, later that becomes Jerusalem. The second of the feasts that was celebrated was called the Feast of the First Fruits, or the Feast of the First Harvests, that signified what? Does anyone remember what this signified? It happened 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it signified something very important within the Exodus journey. It signified That's okay. It signified the giving of the law on Sinai. Okay? So on that particular feast, they were also supposed to come to Jerusalem and to celebrate the first fruits and the reminder of 50 days after Passover, when they were released from Egypt. Now we're celebrating the giving of Torah, the giving of the law at Sinai. And then, of course, 4 or 5 months later, there's the third and the final feast is the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkot. And this was the feast to celebrate the ingathering of the harvest at the end of the year, but also the whole notion of the Feast of Booths was to remind the people that they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and that God gave them protection and gave them, brought them through while they were living in these tents. So each and every one of these feasts was designed for the people of Israel to remember the story, right? To remember the story. You teach it to your sons. You make them understand. There is command after command after command to remember the story. And through the story of the Exodus, what we come to see is that what matters to God is that he is providing his people, the people of God, a story, an event that they are to base their entire understanding and worldview on, that answers the question, who we are, where are we, what's our problem, what's our solution, what are the primary symbols that Israel comes up with through that story? The symbol of the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the tabernacle, the symbol of the symbol of circumcision. There's a lot of things that Israel is provided through the schema of the Exodus story for understanding their world. Okay? So, any questions about that?
I have a question, but you might think it's a little
Go for it. We're here to just entertain right now.
Okay, I don't want to pull things too far off for other people. So.
Nope, go for it.
Okay, well, here's just
Would you mind asking your question to the mic, not for
Oh, really?
amplification? We're recording it.
Oh, you're,
Yes.
oh.
Yeah, just for the.
Oh, that makes it even
just
worse.
so we know what you're responding
I don't even know what this is.
Thank you.
Is it on?
It's on.
Okay, so, so here's my question. Does any of this, is this going to matter in heaven? Like, are we going to maintain this identity forever? Or is this just linear? Is it something that will eventually, like our births, will eventually outgrow? Or do you think this will maintain this identity in heaven and forever?
By identity, do you mean like, am I going to have an understanding of who I am and where I've come from and the life that I live prior to being dying and being resurrected to new life?
Well, I mean, as people of God, will this story continue with us forever? I mean, do you think this will be maintained forever? A part of the mentality. I guess it's more of a philosophical question. I don't know. Maybe I just thought of it.
So, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that our self-understanding and our histories and the lives that we live are for sure going to be things that we bring with us a sense of who our identity, like, into heaven. I think that is likely true. I mean, what is heaven? Where is heaven? What's the new creation? And where are we going to actually be? And that's a different set of questions. But I think that the story that God's telling is a story that is while in some way, shape, or form that story is going to come to a climax and a resolution in one way at the end of this age, I think that the resonances of that story and the reality of the God who redeems is going to be very present with us in the future.
Just wondering if, because as this is an identity of a people, as you say, and a worldview and everything, if that is a continuum eternally, if it just continues to build and grow and, probably, I mean, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Why not?
Why not?
But anyway, thanks for
Yeah.
entertaining that question.
For sure. All right, another question over here.
Do the stories conflict? Or can the story conflict with the praxis? I'm effectively also asking about the concept of the untrustworthy narrator, the untrustworthy storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big question. You've attributed the book of Exodus to a divine figure and not to scribes.
Well, in some way, I haven't attempted to delineate the difference.
I'd like you to. Just because saying that God invented the mnemonic devices of 10 plagues being 10 fingers, and the way that we remember the story of Exodus, like, do we need to know who's responsible for that story? I mean, like, have we assumed it, or are we allowed to question that story, to question the storytellers of that story?
That's a great question.
I don't see any reason why we should not be allowed to question the story. And in fact, what we have, inscripturated into this Hebrew Bible is in fact not just words fallen from heaven, but we have very much, as Ron was talking about, we have this tension between this divine and human Bible, and we have humans that are writing and are making choices about how they're going to tell the story and what they're going to emphasize and not emphasize and what they're going to highlight, etc. And so very much a human product of human hands is the story that we have. And of course, within Christianity, we have certain beliefs around what that all means and how those human authors are inspired to, narrate the story from a narratival perspective that is very much in line with the values and the values of the God that they believe that they're capturing in this story. But I don't think I'm really answering your question. I don't know if.
I mean, the book of Exodus is largely compiled between like 6th century BC and 4th century BC, right before the Israelites go off into, I think it's like the second exile.
Put into its final form, for sure.
Exactly. So,
yeah.
but you get a sense of sort of editorial decisions made on the behalf of a sort of priestly class. I mean, the emphasis of the tabernacle plays a kind of central role, and that in itself, this kind of meshing together of various folkloric tales, this various Hebrewic kind of mythology, tends to conflict with itself, tends to come at itself and devour itself into paradox and various other kind of problematic elements.
Do you have an example that you'd like to share?
We could just start with, Abraham, Isaac, the difference between the Abraham, Isaac test of faith as opposed to the narrative of Moses. Those are fundamentally different sorts of stories.
Okay.
And they largely unfold entirely different ways. I mean, even
I don't think that sort of necessitates an understanding that there is conflict there.
The praxis of the law and the story of Moses repudiating the law during the Shema Israel speech, like there's a good example of conflict, of a sort of paradox within the Bible, between authors potentially.
I don't know what you're referring to.
Maybe.
Hold on for 1 second, Debbie. These are interesting questions. I have some more that I want to say.
Oh, go for it.
But I finished the thought because
the only thing is like the storytellers.
When does Moses repudiate the law?
That's a big question we can talk about later.
Okay.
Just acknowledging the authorship of the Bible,
yeah,
and the inherent conflicting interests in that authorship. Acknowledging that stories effectively kind of consume each other, that they don't sit consistently, that there are gaps within symbols, if you will, and put it another way. I mean, like the very creation of a Jesus, the very message of Jesus is Old Testament wasn't enough. So we can sit in some ways, a sort of, as Judeo-Christians at least, sort of easiness that these are not revolutionary ideas. Jesus actually came up with them a long time ago. There's something up with the Old Testament that just came to fundamentally fulfill, not do away with. But there's a conflict there in the Old Testament, and it looks like an authorial problem. It looks like an editorial issue. And I was just wondering if you just maybe my simple question is, you said Exodus is the story that God gave us, or God gave the Jews for them to understand themselves. And I was wondering, I guess I didn't hear Ron's speech, maybe that everyone always punts me back to like prior speeches. They all hate my questions. But again, like, how do we deal with the gaps in symbols? How do we deal with stories that actually seem to work at odds with each other? And what do we do with the fact that there clearly are authors who are going again? Seems to be Yahwehists, and there seem to be like kind of priestly class versions of stories. Those are different stories. They're telling different stories about faith.
So, I think, Toby, one of the things that it's important to keep in mind is that we have, whenever we, and you know this as well as anyone, whenever we come up or bump up against what appear to be tensions in the text and that sort of thing, then of course we've got to wrestle with understanding, like, why might this tension exist. What you're referring to that has a lot to do with source criticism is in terms of understanding how the text in its final form was brought together, potentially just after the Babylonian exile, et cetera, is highly there's a lot of questions about whether or not there is a Yahwist text and a priestly text and and whether or not the excavation that we can really do behind these purported sources is actually much more than our best sort of like guesses into the mystery that is truly shrouds the in many ways the text as we have it in its final form. So anyway, but for sure, if there are places where we see tension, we want to be able to like wrestle with that, and I think the most important thing that we have to do is we have to approach it not with a sort of like a skepticism, but approach it in a way that allows for the possibility that the text may in fact, we want to be as generous as we can to, and be able to, as much as possible, I think, within Christianity, allow for those tensions to point us towards ways of understanding what God is doing and the story that may in fact inform us of reality in a way that is that helps us, and so anyway, I don't know without getting into a lot of the details, but I feel like that's important.
May I say something to that?
Sure.
I know you want to get back on to your lecture. Okay, so just for clarification in your question, are you asking about, you're not asking about the validity of the texts, you're just asking about the interpretation? Is that whether it's valid or not? You're asking about, I mean, we're agreeing that there's text, right? And just how it's valid, how it's interpreted and edited, like you said, right? The interpretation of the text, is that what you're kind of questioning?
I mostly just wanted to know how we should consider the storytellers. Who are
Right.
telling the story, and what we do with their seeming contradictive methods.
Okay, so that's detail, right? And what you're saying, what I'm understanding you to say, is that you're looking at the overview and the meaningfulness of it in its entirety and what direction it gives. Is that what you're saying? Kind of like pulling it out and saying, okay, there are these detailed questions and gaps and things that we have to wrestle with, these mysteries. However, if you get above that and look over it, you're looking at it a bigger picture and a direction and meaning that it gives. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the question that
Okay.
I'm seeking to answer tonight is how do we understand the story, the fundamental story of God's salvation of Israel, and what that story, what that event did in terms of creating a schema for them to understand themselves and their identity in the world and their God, and what the implications for that moving forward potentially for us. And certainly there are lots of, so I'm not attempting to, speak
Right.
to the questions that Toby's interested at the moment, but those are certainly interesting questions. Yeah.
Right, you're going already with an agreed story that is presented, and then we're carrying on from that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but I think that your question, the thing that you said was very intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. I thought I saw a hand over here, but okay. All right. So, boy, you come at these things and you have this like structure for the things you're going to say, and then you realize like, oh, I really needed 3 weeks to do this and not just like 1 week. So let's like have the opportunity to let me talk for about 10 more minutes, and then I do want to leave time to continue to dialogue. And so what I want to say is, granted that the God of the Bible provided in history a narrative that he's asking for his people to live out of. And of course, it's not just the Exodus, but we have the whole of the Old Testament from creation up through the time of the exile, and is this big narrative that Israel has that provides them ongoing with this ongoing question of, wait a second, what's happening now? I mean, we get at the end of the Old Testament question, Israel and the prophets questioning what happened. Our temple is destroyed. It's in ruins. The Babylonians have come. What happened to this mercy that you said was going to be new every morning? What happened to the Davidic king that you said was going to remain on the throne? What's going on? And so at the close of the final act of the Old Testament, very much still a question of what's the solution to our problem? We still have a huge problem here. And of course, the prophets speak of the solution in various ways, shapes, and forms. But one of the ways that they speak of the solution is by using Exodus imagery to recall the faithfulness of their God and the story of the redemption that He had originated for them back during the period that they were in Egypt. And He uses the Exodus imagery to be able to say, I am not done yet with you. In fact, I'm going to lead you back out of Babylon. I'm going to make highways in the deserts for you. I'm going to for you. And Isaiah, in second Isaiah, chapter 40 through 66 is rife with imagery that records the Exodus in a way that tells the people that God is going to do again what He had. And Isaiah cries out, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down again, and the mountains would that we would see," and all this language that connects back to Sinai. And of course, interestingly, and it has both the God who is the author of this entire story, but in fact the gospel writers themselves, when we get to the place where finally the Messiah that was promised comes along, we have throughout the gospel stories lots of thematic images and motifs and actions that Jesus takes that points us back to what? It points us back to the Exodus, right? If in fact, the central story of the Exodus can be sort of summarized that a God who wants to keep covenant promises comes to save His people, Exodus story. He uses a man through whom God wants to act and speak, Exodus story. That man gets empowered with signs and wonders to testify that God is both with him and also that God is going to use that man to redeem the people from their slavery, Exodus story. That God is going to make a covenant with those people and that they're going to be His people and He's going to be their God and He's going to be merciful to them, Exodus story. That the man through whom God is going to save His people is also going to become the mediator between God and the people, and that mediator is going to speak on behalf of God and bring the words of God to the people, Exodus story. And that man is going to ultimately provide Israel with food and water, just as through their desert wanderings, Exodus story, and that that the beginning of that story starts with the slaying of a lamb and the blood that gets put over the doorposts to signify the mercy that God wants to have on those who are willing to listen to him. Exodus story, that all of those things can absolutely and do absolutely get mapped onto the gospel and onto Jesus. That Jesus, just as Moses was, and in fact the writer of Hebrews says that Moses chose to bear the reproach of being a Messiah rather than living with the passing pleasures of sin in Egypt. That Moses was in fact the first of God's anointed. And that Jesus in many ways, shapes, and forms gets compared to and becomes the Moses figure of the Gospels. And of course, Jesus goes out into the wilderness and is tested for 40 days. We have Jesus going up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and like Moses, we could multiply the examples, but that what God seems to have done, what Jesus seems to have done, what the writers of the gospel seem to have done, is they have said this story is absolutely fundamental to the people that it was being brought to initially. The people of Israel were supposed to be able to, because of the story, because of their identity, because of the symbols, because of their practice, they were supposed, because of that fundamental story of their national being, bound up in this story of God's redemption, when Jesus shows up and starts to perform the signs and wonders that he performs, and starts to say the things that he says, and to go up on a mountain and teach from the top of a mountain, and to start glowing like fire like Moses was after Moses spent 40 days with God. All of these things were supposed to trigger in the imagination and the minds of Israel. This is the one that the prophet said was going to come and act the new Exodus for us. So again, we don't have time, but let's like bring it back to ourselves. Like, where are we now in this story? Well, I think that what's important for us, and again, skipping a lot of material here, but I think what's important for us is that we understand that story is fundamental to how we view ourselves and view our identity and the world around us, and that as Christians, we have been offered a story of a new Exodus that we are to understand ourselves living in and out of. As the author of Hebrews says, as long as it is still called today, right, we need to be understanding that the story of redemption, that just as Israel was redeemed out of Egypt, and had this initial salvation, it wasn't the people who were initially redeemed out of Egypt that ultimately got to enjoy the rest of God. The people that got to enjoy the rest of God were those that clung to the promises of God in the process of the Exodus journey. And what it seems, or what it appears to have happened, is that in Jesus inaugurating this new Exodus by his own death and his own blood, and us appropriating that story, that moment, that death, he has set us free into this journey. And as the author of Hebrews says, we have not come now to a mountain that is quaking with fire, and a mountain with trumpets and of words that we can't stand to listen to, but we've come to the new Zion, and we've come to the Son. We've come to Jesus, who is the mediator of a better covenant. And but we're still on this journey, right? We're still to appropriate and understand that, like Abraham, like Isaac, like Jacob, like Moses, none of us have been able to arrive at the ultimate destination that was ultimately promised, and we are still on the journey. And so I think that the Exodus story, while it is fundamental to understanding God's salvation from a biblical perspective, and certainly understanding Jesus and the Gospels, it's also a really important story for us in our own lives, because all of us need the encouragement of being able to get up in the morning and put our pants on and face another day with the angst of the reality that we're not where we want to be. Life is not yet concluded for us, and God has us on a journey, and we're in the process of becoming. And so, anyway, I'm running out of time here, but so that's sort of what I wanted to share tonight, is the importance of this story for our understanding of our lives and understanding of what Jesus has done, and how I think especially in this particular community for a long time we have eschewed the notion of tradition, and we've often eschewed the notion of and I think there's been a rightness in it so far as it goes, but I think that the validity of keeping in mind through liturgy, through practice, through reading, the powerful story world that we have been offered to understand ourselves and our God and what we're doing in life now, in the light of the Exodus event, I think is really an important thing. So, anyway, thoughts, questions? Thank you.
Kind of goes with Martin Luther King Day.
Yeah, Martin Luther King absolutely appropriated. So many people have appropriated the Exodus as a story of liberation, and rightly so. Yeah.
It seems one of the concepts that is the hardest for us to understand philosophically or potentially any other way is the concept of temporality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's that stories provide us a really tangible understanding of that. It sort of examples it for us without thinking of time abstract will probably make your head explode if you can do it right. I mean, like it's an extremely difficult, it's a difficult mathematical concept to think of time. It's a different conceptual concept to kind of imagine and put into tangibles or symbols the meaning of time, like how we measure it, what does it mean, where does it come from, what's the subjective. I mean, if you do quantum physics and read any of these articles, they're deeply beholden to a respect for the concept of time and as it unfolds. And I think about our unknownness, the symbols in our own life that we don't have representation for. And that moment where you said becoming as that kind of core element of the tie between the new and the old, between what Jesus is kind of, I don't know if you'd use the word like mimic representation. Yeah, mimic representation of the Exodus. The way I appreciated your act of acknowledgement of the kind of stylistic cribbing that the New Testament has for the Exodus, for the figure of Moses and the figure of Jesus. That I've really deeply found your teachings on that like extraordinarily rewarding, extraordinarily illuminating, and both to be aware. I mean, but in regards to the concept I was saying earlier, like to be aware of the strings of this kind of puppet show, not to say anything pejorative about a puppet show, they can be very entertaining, but to be aware of where the strings are coming in is actually, it can make it even more beautiful, can make it sort of more novel, to know how these things are more sophisticatedly connected with relationship to historicity and authorship, and these are good, enjoyable questions, and I don't think they diminish from the thing you said, especially in the sense that I love I love the fact that you started with story and you brought in the word becoming, because again, I don't know how we understand diachronically the word faith, the thing that's God's calling us potentially to understand and do. It is it's a diachronic experience, not a synchronic experience. It doesn't occur in a single instance of time. It's something that stretches out and fumbles through and has. And when I think of in my version of the story, when I think of the priestly class, they are not just simply symbol manipulators and sort of like mistrustworthy authors, although they can be. There are also some people who are deeply invested in conveying the faithfulness of Yahweh, the conveying also his steadfastness, that through trials and through wilderness and through darkness and through serpent bites and all these unpleasantnesses, one's ability to believe in God is not dependent upon one's ability to see or feel God. And I think that message in Exodus, and then as exemplified by what Jesus is recorded as being. I mean, you have a moment, especially on the cross, where you don't get a sense that Jesus is with God. You feel a sort of great chasm there that I think relates very closely to our contemporaneity with the Christ figure. Having said that, at what point do you begin to at what point can you make judgments as to what other people are doing with the story of the Bible? Like, at what point can they break the story, if you will? I mean, people have very different versions of theological perspectives and paradigms perspective. Do you get a sense of like when have you pushed the story so far that it ceases to be the story that we're trying to hold on to? That's a big ass question too. But I know you got that. That was yours. That was easy. You got that.
Well, Toby, I don't know. I'm not sure that I fully understand the question that you're asking.
I guess I'll refer to your intuitive sense.
Okay.
At what point, when someone is conversing about the story of the Bible, do you begin to go, wait, hold on? Like that one moment where you're like, where's the barrier there? I could tell. I mean, people. Joseph Smith is an example. I don't mean to drag the Mormons through the mud. I only simply mean to bring Joseph Smith into the equation. Muhammad also borrows from the story of the Bible. At what point in storytelling, how do you ground your storytelling? And at what point, when you hear other people tell stories of the Bible or of this book that you clearly care about, at what point do you start to go, wait a minute?
I mean, is there conflict in the story?
No, I know there's tons of conflict. I mostly want to know where Ryan settles with when a story becomes fictitious to the point that it can't be. What's that resistance point for you?
Toby, I'm trying to understand, and it could be my struggle with like this lack of sleep and all the rest, but are you asking the question, when I hear other people handle the story, what are the red flags that I have when I hear how they handle the story?
Sure. I mean, how do you make this differentiations between stories of the Bible, stories that other people tell of the Bibles? You have a favorite, you favor in some ways N.T. Wright. There's a sort of like worldview parallelism. There's a sort of narrative that he is effectively spinning that you are more impartial to understand or believe or like or favor. In contrast, there are other theologians.
Yeah.
How do you weigh the stories? How do you contrast the stories?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it really depends on. I mean, case by case basis. Like, what is it that? I mean, I think that in some way, shape, or form, for me personally, when I think that I'm, at least at this point in time, committed to seeing the story hang together, and that what we have is actually a unified story because we have a single actor behind the whole thing who has a purpose and a vision and a plan for what it is that he wants to accomplish in history. So some non-starters would be people who really want to start from the point of discontinuity and understand not. And I think a lot of times it belies sort of, obviously their own sort of like perspective and worldview that they don't have the same theological sort of underpinning that I do about God as author and the sovereignty and determinism that he is creating and willing all that is. And so when someone is when someone speaks to discontinuity and really wants to like focus on discontinuity, that generally throws up a red flag. Is that a problem for me on another level? No. Like I think we ought to like deal with all the questions and issues that are at hand. But the theological, how we understand the Bible as scripture, how we understand how the story hangs together, how we understand the covenants and whether or not the covenants that God gave to Israel and whether or not Jesus, in fact, is fulfilled all of those covenants yet or not, and to what extent, and this tension between the now and the not yet, and those are all really important questions that decide how we see the story unfolding and where we are in the story or not in the story. And but I want to like read people who want to work with that and make it hang together, not with people who are just interested in sort of other. I mean, I'm not saying that well. I'm not sure if I'm even answering your question, but is that an answer to your question?
I mostly was looking for a sort of heuristic of how you measure stories between stories. Like you think about Jesus being a sort of mimicry of Moses. That's a sort of paradigm you've purchased into. You're like, yeah, that seems fairly plausible. I see good reasonings for that. Mm-hmm. In that case, we have a sort of seamlessness, but interestingly enough, it's a sort of discordant seamlessness because they don't overlap perfectly.
No, they don't.
You have the story of Jesus, and in some ways that's a sort of, Jesus is a sort of, maybe you could use the word fulfillment. I think that I'm fairly comfortable with the Bible saying that. So Jesus is a sort of fulfillment of something that also occurred in the Exodus. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, Jesus is also a fulfillment of a sort of promise that Abraham also received. The covenantal tradition typically ties and all people will be blessed to all people not just being all the Jews. Mm-hmm. That this grafting on needs be occur, and that the mimicry of Christ for Moses is both powerful in the sense of its similarities, its shared symbolic unity, but is even ironically even more powerful for what it does not share. That there's actually, and again, actually, I think I'd give Moses a little more credit, but the powerful paradox and the powerful gaps between the Exodus narrative, mostly the Exodus narrative as interpreted by Pharisees at the time. I think there's a much more dynamic reading of Moses, even as the more I study him. But my question was really about, you have these stories that are told about Christ throughout all Christian history. Mm-hmm. And my question was kind of asking you to kind of open up about how do you call it? How do you call them one way or another? I mean, Luther has a certain methodology of interpreting the Bible. N.T. Wright has one. There are paradigms abound, especially about Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. He's a powerful historical figure. Mostly, I mean, you gave me some element of like your inherent leanings are ones that are sympathetic toward unity, toward a sort of like symbolic continuity, sort of. And again, you use the word narrative because the narrative is sort of like, a narrative is a unifying plot device. There's a sort of, you can't, you could have postmodern narratives, they exist, but they're really frustrating and annoying. I mean, like, so again, your emphasis on narrative gives me some clues, and I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on those features, other things that you would recommend, or if I was somebody saying, if I was so removed from the Christian narrative that I didn't understand it, how would you convey its value if I didn't already have a presupposition for it being, for singularity, for unification? How do you sell, what is it about yourself that wants this story this way? And now I'm garbling my own question, which is frustrating. Don't make me.
Are there other ways of interpreting the story?
Sure.
I don't know any other ways.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
I'd love to comment. I'm very interested in your question. I want to make sure I understand it, though. So it sounds like what you're asking, Ryan, is who do you trust and why when it comes to hermeneutics? And then when you decide you trust someone, is that a function of correspondence to reality, or is that merely a function of coherence?
Sure.
Or is it both? Does that make sense?
I'll take that as my question. That sounds much better than
I don't know if that helps at all, but that's kind of what I hear.
Right. Okay.
I'm also appealing to a sort of you don't have there's no wrong answer for this. This is largely about what you've discovered.
Right.
I'm asking just like your expertise, effectively.
Yeah. Chris?
Maybe we wrap it up quick, and maybe you guys can
We
carry
can-
on afterwards or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, Toby, I mean, those are good questions. I don't, and I appreciate the clarification of the question that you offered, Elliot. I mean, if I've understood your question, how do we understand, I mean, how do we understand who Christ is in the midst of this larger story, and who are the voices that I listen to about telling me who he is and that sort of thing?
That last part.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. I mean, as I've mentioned, and as you've mentioned, someone more recently who has been helpful to me in making sense of how the New Testament draws on the Old Testament and its the allusion to story, the allusion to big themes and motifs is certainly N.T. Wright. Do I think he's got it right all the time? No, of course not. But what I like about him is he among others, and certainly others that we're more familiar with here in this community, was one of the guys that really was at the forefront of calling us to remember that Jesus was a Jew in the midst of this morass of biblical studies that sort of had lost that vision, that Jesus was a Jew, and that the people that were writing about him were Jews, and they were fundamentally using categories and using the Old Testament to help to signify and highlight the connections that Jesus had with Abraham, with Moses, with David, with this new covenant that was promised, and that dealing well with those significations and recognizing that those just have to be a part of the way in which the story of the New Testament is being told, to build on the shoulders of an unfinished story of the Old Testament. That I think that is just so right. And anyway, I don't know if so.
That was it.
Okay.
That's kind of what I was hoping for.
Yeah.
Just kind of an explanation of what stories connect and what's important about the storytellers that you're following. What's
Right.
important about how you're putting this together is of supreme importance to me.
Yeah.
Would you mind if I said something?
To me?
Yeah. Well, to you, because you're the one posing all the questions here, which are good questions. Are you asking, because, I mean, what about, I don't know if this is off or not, but what about the fact that we connect this story too with Jesus? I mean, Jesus who spoke about these things and referred himself into the story, right? He blended himself into this story. He himself brought up the Old Testament and this story of the Jews wandering. So he himself connected himself to the story. Is that
Writing that down, unfortunately.
so? You're just speaking basically from the point of the interpretation of the literature or the
big question
scribing or whatever.
is we have a lot of people who have commentaries about such subject matter, and I was just wondering Ryan's kind of off the hip advice on if you want to, what he has found useful in regards to picking some commentaries out of the pile and saying these commentaries are useful, these commentaries they don't work.
Kind of like unearthing the story itself.
Or being good at hermeneutics, I mean, being faithful to the hermeneutics that we're required to do to try to understand something as complicated as an Old Testament Judaist tradition that's overlapped onto by a Judeo-Christian one.
Well, and recognizing that, as Toby pointed out, we've got two things going on. We have Jesus, who is very aware and very absolutely sees himself and understands himself in continuity with the story, and I think that that's clear. But we have this second move, which is the move of the writers who decided that they were going to tell his story, and that in telling his story, they're making choices, they're highlighting, they're emphasizing, they're couching, they're contextualizing his ministry in many ways, shapes, and forms to help point people back here. And that's their choice to do, not Jesus's himself. Now, I believe that they were acting in good faith, and that they, in how they were going about telling the story of Jesus, and his significance, and was that they weren't just coming up with random ideas on their own. That I think that originated with what was true to the spirit of his ministry. But that as Toby's pointing out, what we have is stories about Jesus in the Gospels that weren't written by Jesus himself, and so we have to understand what is the ethos, what is the view, the understanding of the writers, and what they were trying to do and trying to say about Jesus. So we have to stop. Okay.